July 30, 1944. On the eastern bank of the Vistula, Colonel David Dragunsky faced a problem no tank officer was supposed to solve with timber and rope. The bridges were gone, the proper pontoons had not arrived, and the Red Army's advance was moving too fast to wait. So Dragunsky ordered tanks onto rafts built from logs and rough boards. 30-ton machines floating on a river, because the road to Berlin had run out of road. But that was not the heaviest thing crossing the Vistula that day. Behind Dragunsky lay a Jewish village called Svyatsk. He had not heard from most of his family since the Germans occupied the region. Ahead of him lay Poland, the Oder, and Berlin. And somewhere between those 2 points was a number he did not yet know. 74. 74 members of the Dragunsky family would be gone by the time he came home. David Abramovich Dragunsky was born on February 15, 1910, in Svyatsk, a small Jewish settlement near Novozybkov in the western reaches of the Russian Empire. He did not begin life as the obvious future commander of a tank brigade. He came from a working family. He left school, worked with his hands, and moved through the hard upward channels the early Soviet system opened to men who could endure its demands. In 1933, he entered the Red Army. 3 years later, he graduated from the Saratov Armored School. By 1938, he had already seen combat against Japanese forces at Lake Khasan, and in July 1941, just weeks after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, he completed his studies at the Franz Military Academy ahead of schedule and went directly into a war that was swallowing trained officers faster than the army could replace them. That war did not begin for Dragunsky with glory. It began with collapse. The German advance tore through Soviet formations, split units from their headquarters, and turned maps into lies before the ink could dry. Dragunsky was wounded in the face. He was concussed. He escaped the Vyazma encirclement. He returned to duty. Then he was wounded again and again. In August 1943, shell fragments struck his abdomen. In December, another wound damaged his liver. Each time, the army sent him away to recover. Each time he came back, not because he was unafraid, not because pain had stopped mattering, but because armored command had become the one language in which the chaos around him could still be forced into sequence. Terrain, fuel timing, gun position, riverbank, exit route. A tank brigade could not be saved by emotion. It could be saved by a commander who saw the ground before the ground killed his men. By late 1943, Dragunsky was commanding the 55th Guards Tank Brigade. After the fighting around Kiev, he was recommended for the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The recommendation was reduced to a lower award. The surviving record shows the downgrade. It does not give us a clean, honest sentence explaining why. And that matters, because history often preserves the decision, while losing the motive. Dragunsky did not stop to argue with the archive. He went back to war. By June 1944, after months of treatment, he had returned to his brigade. The Soviet summer offensives were now ripping open the German front. The strategic direction had reversed. The army that had once been driven east was now moving west with a violence built from 3 years of accumulated loss. But speed created its own danger. Every kilometer stretched fuel lines. Every destroyed bridge could trap armor on the wrong bank. Every hour of delay gave the Germans time to turn retreat into defense. That was the situation when the 55th Guards Tank Brigade reached the Vistula on July 30. The crossing equipment lagged behind. The river did not care. The operational clock did not care. And Dragunsky understood that a bridgehead is most vulnerable before it becomes a bridgehead. So his men gathered logs. They dragged boards from whatever could be stripped, broken, or repurposed. They built rafts under wartime conditions, with enemy resistance still active and no guarantee that the first tank would not roll into deep water and take its crew with it. This was not a cinematic charge. It was harder than that. It was engineering under pressure, weight distribution measured by eye, engines kept low, tracks aligned, men waist-deep in river water guiding steel onto wood that bent under the load. One tank moved, then another, then another. The brigade crossed. That improvised passage helped strengthen the Soviet hold on the Sandomier's bridgehead before German counterattacks could crush it. In August, the fighting became defensive. German infantry and armor struck the bridgehead repeatedly. Dragunsky's brigade held. This time the recognition came through. On September 23, 1944, David Dragunsky was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The medal recognized battlefield command, the rafts, the crossing, the bridgehead. The attacks survived, but medals have a limit. They can record what a man did. They cannot measure everything he was carrying while he did it. By then, Svyatsk had been under German occupation for 3 years. Across the occupied Soviet territories, Jewish communities had not simply suffered the general destruction of war. They had been singled out, assembled, shot, buried, deported, and erased. The machinery of occupation had turned villages into absence. For Jewish soldiers advancing west, liberation often meant approaching places where there was no one left to liberate. Dragunsky did not yet possess the final accounting of his own family. There was no complete list in his pocket, no dramatic message delivered at the perfect hour, only silence. And silence can become its own kind of document. It tells you nothing precisely. It tells you almost everything. In January 1945, the Soviet armies broke out from the Vistula and drove toward the Oder. The movement was immense. Columns rolled through Poland. Fuel trucks fought mud and ice. Repair crews worked beside the road. The dead were left behind because the living had orders to continue. Dragunsky's brigade moved with the 3rd Guards Tank Army. The geography changed, but the problem remained the same. Crossing after crossing, river after river, defensive line after defensive line. Every obstacle was supposed to buy the Germans time. Every hour Dragunsky denied them became another mile west. He had learned something the war taught brutally. Armor is not speed by itself. A tank is only fast when the commander has already solved the ground. When the route is wrong, 30 tons becomes a prison. When the route is right, 30 tons becomes a decision. That was his gift. Not reckless motion. Calculated movement under conditions designed to punish calculation. By the spring of 1945, the target on the map was Berlin. Dragunsky had been wounded so many times that his body had become a second campaign record. He spent part of March and April in treatment again. Then he returned. The Berlin operation did not need symbols. It needed crossings, canals, rail lines, urban choke points, bridges under fire. The 55th Guards Tank Brigade fought at the Teltow Canal and into the capital itself. The official combat accounting credited the brigade with destroying German tanks, assault guns, armored vehicles, artillery, and transport. It also recorded thousands of prisoners and captured rail assets. Those numbers were the language of military proof. They showed what the brigade had broken. They did not show what had already been broken behind its commander. Inside Berlin, streets became firing lanes. Windows became gun ports. Cellars became ambush positions. Rubble blocked tracks and exposed flanks. A tank that turned too early could show its side armor. A tank that waited too long could be hit from above. The city demanded the same skill the Vistula had demanded, only a closer range. Read the obstacle. Find the load-bearing point. Move before the enemy understands what you have seen. Dragunsky's men forced crossings, opened routes, and kept the brigade moving through a city built to resist the final assault. Berlin fell. The regime that had invaded the Soviet Union, occupied Svyatsk, and organized the destruction of Jewish life across Eastern Europe was finished. On May 31, 1945, Dragunsky received a second Gold Star, 2 times Hero of the Soviet Union. A rare distinction, a public answer to what he had done. Then the war ended, and he went home. Not to a victory parade, not first. Home meant Novosibirsk. Home meant Svyatsk. Home meant discovering what silence had concealed. On December 4, 1945, Dragunsky wrote to Shlomo Mikols, chairman of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. The letter gave the loss a number. 74 members of the Dragunsky family had been murdered. Not 74 soldiers, not 74 people lost across a continent. 74 from one family. Sisters, children. Relatives whose lives had once been arranged around kitchens, workrooms, holidays, quarrels, errands, and doors that opened without knocking. He wrote that there were no proper graves, that bones remained scattered in the fields. That sentence changes the entire map of his war. The Vistula crossing was no longer only a tactical achievement. Berlin was no longer only an enemy capital. The distance between Svyatsk and Berlin became a line between cause and consequence. One end held the fields where his family had been murdered. The other held the state that had made their murder policy, and Dragunsky had driven armored columns across the space between them. This is where simple stories usually end. The commander returns. The crime is named. The medals shine. Justice is complete. But Dragunsky's life did not become simple after 1945. He remained in the Soviet military. He rose through the ranks to colonel general. He trained officers. He wrote memoirs. He became a public figure. And decades later, he also became the head of the Soviet Anti-Zionist Committee, lending his name and prestige to a state campaign that many Jews regarded as hostile, coercive, and morally compromised. That fact cannot be removed without falsifying the man. It also cannot erase what came before. He was a Jewish officer who fought a genocidal regime, a commander whose first hero recommendation had once been reduced, a survivor of repeated wounds, a son of Svyatsk who came home to 74 dead relatives, and later, a decorated Soviet general who served a political campaign that remains part of the argument over his legacy. The honest version holds all of it. Not because contradiction makes history more dramatic, because contradiction is what history does to people who survive powerful systems. Dragunsky's medals belonged to the Soviet state. His brigade's achievements belonged to the military record. The debt of Svyatsk belonged to no institution that could restore them. And the letter he wrote in December 1945 belonged to a different kind of archive. One that measured victory not by ground taken, but by who was missing when the soldier finally returned. The number 74 does not make his wartime decisions more heroic. It makes them more human. He did not know the full number while crossing the Vistula. He did not carry a neatly folded message through Berlin. The truth is less theatrical and more severe. He advanced through years of silence. He reached the capital of the enemy. He survived. He received 2 gold stars. And only after the guns stopped did the silence become names. David Dragunsky crossed Europe in a tank. The distance home was longer.